Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and with video here on YouTube. Okay, guys, this week I am bringing back Jeff Wasel, wonderful guest and friend and person who has more than a little bit of experience with this thing that I talked with Jeffrey Augustine a few weeks about, which is GBP Capital. David Gentile, who is a Scientologist, who is in a whole lot of trouble right now with the federal authorities and SEC and other regulatory compliance agencies, as we're going to go over here. His investment firm or company was raided by the FBI. And as you'll recall from my talk with Jeffrey Augustine, there's all kinds of, potential machinations and other things regarding this, and the Church of Scientology itself, and Scientology is not named as any kind of defendant in this or anything like that. They're not getting raided. But the connection with Scientology is so close and so tight, with David Gentile being a Scientology whale, as we like to call them, these very rich donors to Scientology, that that this is obviously Scientology kind of news. So to further look into this and explain what's going on and what could be going on, because we're going to go into the land of supposition a little bit this episode, I'm bringing Jeff on, who has real world experience with forensic accounting and with investigations of this kind from his own education and professional experience. So Jeff, welcome back to my show.
Hi, Chris. It's good to be here. It's always good to talk about a great caper, of which we're looking at one right now, I think. So I understand, you and Jeff has done a wonderful job on his money project about kind of breaking this thing down. And I think it's important for the audience to probably go out to the money project and take a look at kind of the trail here. What I see, it's a classic Reg D, or what they call a private placement vehicle, that the owner, or actually the creators, in this case David Gentile and his board, probably just got in way over their head, as tends to happen with some of this stuff. When you look at this, you look at means, motive, and opportunity from a criminal standpoint. And I'm not going to sit here and say that Gentile went into this thing, as a purposeful defraud, or to purposely defraud people like, say, Bernie Madoff did. But the parallels to classic Ponzi behavior are, it's there. I can't say anything different. In fact, there are principals that are part of this investment that are suing Gentile under the guise of it being a Ponzi scheme. That not so much they're calling that in press releases, but the way that it's described in the indictment or the suit is that the principals used investor capital for personal enrichment and or to give the appearance of liquidity within the fund, which is classic legalese for a Ponzi scheme. So if you look at the way that this thing is structured, private placement vehicles or blind pool investment, or whatever you want to call them, are basically what are called Reg D under the combined federal regulations on investment rules or statutes. And what Reg D says is that you have to be an accredited investor, or somebody that's savvy enough and has the financial chops to be able to accept the risk proposition of a vehicle like GPB or anything else. It's like long-term capital was back in the day. Any of these things that are going to promise, very lucrative returns. But, that's the upside. But there's also a great risk of you losing your capital. The other thing about these things, too, is they tend to be highly illiquid. So it's not something you can turn around like a stock and sell the next day after you pump a lot of money into it. Cardone, for instance, ties up a lot of people's money in his REITs and his real estate investment trusts and things like that. So you have to be prepared to park your money in these things. And a fraudster knows that. He can leverage that capital because theoretically he's operating under the stipulations of the prospectus, of the way that this thing was set up. So if you look at GPB, it's got, I believe, 7 different instruments within it, or I should say asset classes. There's GPB1, GPB2, There's a waste management portfolio, just, several different things that I believe you guys went into the last time. What's of interest are the two vehicles that are kind of probably, I would say, in looking at this, the most lucrative in the sense of where the majority of the capital was harbored, if you will, and also theoretically that would have the best returns. And one is on an automotive portfolio that's essentially a REIT for the real estate that the dealerships are on, but also the actual asset class of the cars and all these other things that go along with with dealerships. And then the other one is waste management and some other, quite what I would call are questionable aggregations of assets, if you will. So probably the best way to break this down from there would be to look at why the feds came in there. The feds are coming in there and saying, okay, how did you lose $700 million of book value off the top of this out of basically these two funds? And the amount of money we're talking about, on the first of this year, July 1st, they reported 25.4%, or a loss of 25.4% in GPB2, and then in their automotive portfolio, almost 40%, which is, that's steep, and certainly, very questionable. So if you dig into this right off the bat, out of that, so what that represents, as I said earlier, about $700 million. Of that, $100 million went to commissions to what are called broker dealers. There's 68 broker dealers that were representing GPB to the market. And interestingly enough, one of the reasons that GPB got called was that a compliance officer at one of these broker dealers said that, hey, this GPB2 holdings should never have gone to market. And this is what good compliance officers do. And I'll talk a little bit about this because that's my background is in compliance. It's just kind of near and dear to me about how this thing broke down. So if you step back and you look at the way that Reg D offerings are not regulated in the same way, say Series 7, the same structures around that stockbrokers and other people have to work to when they're selling stocks to the public. There's different compliance stuff, or compliance essentially are the rules and regulations that ensure that, things are fair, there's equitability. But, there's always...
Let me put that in simpler terms for folks who are kind of, swimming a little bit right now. So basically, not everything that happens on Wall Street, not everything that happens on the stock market equals everything else that happens on the stock market. There are different kinds of investments, different kinds of ways that people can invest their money.
Absolutely.
And Regulation D is a kind of or a set of regulations that apply to a certain kind of investment structure,
Precisely.
which is what GBP was doing. And these are high risk investments. So people know going in that they might not get any of their money back, but they make the risk assessment and they make a decision to throw their money into this. And so there's a certain set of regulations that apply to that kind of investment, which are different from the kind of regulations that might apply, say, to trading IBM stocks on the stock market. These are two different things.
So this is where that concept of an accredited investor that I touched on earlier comes in. You have to have the liquidity and the financial, literally the money in the bank. The federal government wants you to at least be able to cover your losses somewhat, because this is how you get a run on a bank. Or if everybody started losing money in Reg D offerings, it could create a huge, in a way it did in 2008, except that was with, junk real estate. It's the same thing with, junk securities offerings, right?
Okay. So the regulations, the regulatory bodies are watching over this, not necessarily to protect people from making stupid investments, but to make sure that they're not fraudulent investments.
That, and that there's at least some element of parity in there, so that everybody is coming into the market. The free markets theoretically are predicated by the fact that everybody has equal access, right? But we all know that that's not the case. There's market manipulation. All this stuff, right? So in a perfect world, that's what the regulator is trying to at least give some semblance to a perfect world, so that people have an idea of what they're going into, eyes open. All right. However, the big thing with Reg D or private placement or black pool, any of these things that involve huge returns that are basically the province of private equity. You always hear about private equity guys making these huge, $300-400 million salaries and all that stuff. Well, the reason is that they know how to play. They know how to play the market well. They know how to bundle stuff enough in a way that is they can either absorb the loss, or if the loss is spread enough, the risk is spread enough to the point where it's not going to completely devalue the whole portfolio and the thing crashes. So it's very mathematical. It's very, I mean, the risk calculations in this stuff are incredible, but there's a scientific basis for it. But also there's a capricious nature of the market, right? The market will just do stuff. But the thing about private equity is that it's very structured around very specific things. So there's kind of what the control variables are as compared to the old, the whole, trying to game the Standard & Poor 500, the actual stock market. It's, nobody can really do that. I mean, everybody has, pays all kinds of money for guys to send them newsletters about how they can make millions on Wall Street. Well, yeah, it's always going to be on any given day, anybody's going to lose their shirt or make a lot of money, right?
Right. So basically, when we say, this old adage that Wall Street's basically legalized gambling, there is a lot of truth to that.
Absolutely, it is.
Okay.
And I would say there's a lot of illegal gambling that goes on too, just because of the nature of what's happening. And this is what the illegal gambling goes on in these types of private, these private placement vehicles, because there is so much money at stake that people just ignore the rules, and this is what happens, and in a way though, if you look at Madoff as a classic idea of regulatory, they're talking about a sleep at the switch. I mean, the Feds, the SEC just completely dropped the ball on that. They were told over and over again that Madoff, there was just no way these returns were real. In fact, the guy wrote a book about it and said, this guy, there's no way this can work. But the state district, everybody that was anybody ignored it until the whole thing came down in a big house of tears. So I guess, the good thing that came out of that is that the GPBs of the world, FINRA, the Financial Regulatory Authority that's kind of the cop for the Securities and Exchange Commission, if you will, the guys that look at the actual legality of behavior in the market, came back and said, well, we really need to pump up the protocols and the regulatory environment. Plus, we need to get tighter with the whole anti-money laundering and post-Patriot Act, what's called know your due diligence, enhanced due diligence, and know your customer provisos, preventing dirty money from getting into the system. Well, a lot of that also works to prevent the regulations from being abandoned, because you have to have processes and procedures, you have to have a compliance officer, you have to have all this stuff, and witness the idea that it was actually a whistleblower from a compliance officer at a broker-dealer that called time on GPB. It's interesting to note that GPB lost a compliance officer back when this first started coming down. He retired. He resigned the day that their auditor resigned back in November of last year. So the compliance, if you look at the compliance history of GPB, it's atrocious. And then you look at the way that they're looking at their investments. So they've got 5-star cartage was probably the largest component of their waste haulage or their waste management portfolio. And they were getting nailed for regulatory and safety violations. So obviously nobody at GPB was doing due diligence to go in and say, okay, that's the biggest component of where these things fall down for us, is that these guys are just looking at the dollars. They're not looking at the actual structural problems that an investment might have, which is the nature where the capital is coming from, how the people actually involved in the investment, guys running what they're going to pump money into. This is Warren Buffett saying, always, understand what you're going to invest in. This is taking it to the nines. They can't be bothered to put 3 people to go down to a cartage company and see that there's glass lying over the place and no fire extinguisher. Stuff like that, common sense, and this is the duty of care, a fiduciary responsibility. And they're saying that they're doing this to their investors. This is the other, component of a fraud, is the complete abrogation, or, the ignoring the rules that, so that you can get a higher return, because that's going to cost money. So obviously your margins go away, blah, blah, blah.
So really what we're talking about is you have David Gentile, or you have these players who are putting this thing together and running it. They are doing it in a slipshod, half-assed manner. They're not complying with the laws they're supposed to. You mentioned, attention on the dollar, maximal return on investment, screw the rules. This sounds very much, and we're sort of setting the stage here, or laying all of this out for a reason, guys. We're not just talking about this because it's all very interesting, boring regulatory stuff. We're trying to make a point here that we have guys who are engaged in what appears to be, or what is parallel to, or very similar to, fraudulent activity. And I can't help but think, because there's Scientology involved in this, that there are Scientology principles at play here. Make it go right, it's sort of a wing it and prayer sort of approach and attitude that is rife throughout Scientology. Screw the rules, screw, any sort of regulations or WOG law, that kind of thing. We've seen this manifested within the Sea Org and within Scientology over and over and over again. So here's a Scientology whale setting up this investment fund, and people are putting money into it, and he's just sort of running the thing on a bit of a wing and a prayer. Am I getting this?
Somewhat. So I want to make it clear that you have part of putting together a vehicle. This is a huge vehicle. This is, we're talking, $2-3 billion under management, right? This is not something to blink at. Well, you're predicating the collection of these assets on the fact that the people you're doing business with at least are trying to do the right thing as well. And when I say the right thing, at least adhere to what the feds are saying about the way a registry should be structured as a combined investment, the way that your portfolio has been managed, say all this collection of car dealerships or a collection of waste haulage, all the stuff that is combined into GPB's portfolio, right? The thing that screams to me, though, about the questionable nature of this is Gentile he was an accountant working for his father. He has no private equity experience. So he's got guys around him. I mean, is he a useful idiot? Who's going into this? And there's Scientology people on the board. I think Jeff broke down the composition of the board. I think there's like 5 or 6 people on there. So I've always had a theory in my mind about the way Scientology operates. And this is, what I call the Forrest Gump of Scientology, Manuel. I can never say the guy's name right, but he always pops up in these things. He was part of Onkos with Jeff Peshbach. Here he is with GPB. This guy is not a rookie. This guy's a heavy hitter, so he knows what he's doing. So is there an aggregation of capital that comes into these things just because it's whale money, and you've got smarter people in the room than the guy at the figurehead, i.e. in this case, Daniel Gentile? His father was a very accomplished, very well-known Long Island accountant for many years. So, he's legit, but yet he's not legit as who on the street is looking at this guy going, huh? Where'd he come from? So then that ignorance that percolate down the chain, or is there a very specific conscious knowledge of what they're doing is questionable? Because again, we're looking at the margins. We're looking at the upside of this is incredibly lucrative. So then that's where this idea of this kind of questionable compliance percolates all the way down to these investments, to the way that they do their due diligence. Due diligence is huge. I cannot say that enough to the audience. That this is what any prudent investment vehicle or the regulators work on. Everybody works on due diligence. That simply means that you go do your homework. You put somebody on the floor of the shop floor to make sure that it exists. You're just not buying some empty building in Brooklyn, right? And that there's machines in there that are making something, right? So in this case, it would be going out and making sure that these waste haulage companies are doing their thing. And the thing that you always have to look at in New York and waste haulage is, where's the mob, right?
Right.
Cartage, quote unquote, is what it's called, has been a mob scam since Vito Genovese's days, right? It's been around forever. And the difference between what he's doing with 5 Star and some of these other things is what's called private cartage versus cartage that's run, or, this is garbage collection basically, by the city of New York or the boroughs in the city of New York. The city really tried to crack down on mob influence and also questionable safety and union behavior, all the stuff that goes around this. But yet, because of the free market stipulations of the way that the world works, somebody steps up and says, okay, I can do this cheaper, outside of the regulatory remit or outside of the way the city's managing it. And that's where you come up with private cartage. So these are guys that go around at night and collect mostly from commercial establishments like restaurants and things like that. And there's a whole, I've got an article right here from, I think it's, who is it? ProPublica did a very good article about the FBI looking at GPB, their relationship with 5 Star, and the whole thing is just rife with a lack of due diligence, union problems, safety problems. And so what as GPB comes out, after the fact, makes this big thing on their website, hey, we've hired, a safety regulator for our waste haulage portfolio. Well, for crying out loud, why did you do that when you started the thing?
Exactly.
You look at the history of GPB, it's all reactive. These guys had no clue from the start outside of how they put this thing out there to solicit money into it, to make money. I mean,
we could be looking at a couple different scenarios: fraud through ignorance and desperation and stupidity, or fraud through pre-calculation, or a evolving mess where they're ignorant and stupid and then they get smart, but as they're getting smart, they are continuing to make these somewhat fraudulent or stupid decisions and getting in more and more and more trouble. And it appears that there's a very real possibility, based on what you were just talking about there with what some of the investments were made into, that they were investing in things that are actually mob-backed.
I wouldn't say necessarily that they may be mob-backed, but there might be mob money in them. Because you have to understand that after, the mob was basically, put out to pasture for, I would say, in its earlier iteration in the early 90s. I mean, after Gotti went down and Gasso and some of these other guys went to jail, the families basically shifted from street crime to financial crime, stock manipulation, and the mob is always invested in legitimate enterprises. So, I mean, Paul Castellano, the Concrete Club in the 80s, right? If you're going to build a building in New York in the 80s, you bought concrete from the mob or a company owned by the mob. So I don't want to be sitting here and saying that David Gentile is going down to the corner and getting stacks of cash with the VIG of 30%, right? That's not what we're saying.
Right. No, and I want to be clear about this. Yeah.
What we're saying is that some of the companies and this is where we start getting into where the money plays and how the mafia loans money. If you look at the way that the mob launders money, it's through legitimate enterprises, but they're usually heavily involved in union and other environments that they already control the context of which that investment can be manipulated. So gambling, loan sharking, all these things. But yet you can do that in an environment that is legitimized by certain industries or sectors. Waste haulage, concrete, recycling, computer recycling is a big thing now, all these things. The mob has its fingers in a lot of this stuff.
And selling cars.
Well, yeah, I mean, the mob for years used to invest. In fact, this was Meyer Lansky's big thing. He got into auto dealerships right at, big time after the war because everybody had spare money. Cars were big, right? The war, you couldn't buy a car. So the 50s, all of a sudden, bang, the dealership, Ford, GM, Detroit is just pumping out these cars. So the beauty of that is that you can own the land that the dealership's on. You can own the cars themselves, the actual inventory. You can own the financial chain that helps somebody buy a car. I mean, you want to talk about printing money. Auto dealerships were a great thing, and they're also you can, great way to pay your buddies off. Hey, Vito, go down and just tell, old Rick at the dealer, that Two Fingers sent you and just drive away from the car and we're clear, right? I mean, the amount of mob debt that was cleared by just giving people cars, especially in Vegas and places like that, is just off the charts. I mean, it was a classic tit for tat Goomba play, right? So auto dealerships have always been in that. So does that mean that the portfolio that Gentile is managing? No, probably not. I mean, you look at Premier as a very legitimate company. And it's interesting that the guy that runs it is turning around and suing GPB, saying that they are a Ponzi scheme. So, you know, you can always say there's no honor among thieves, but then you can also say that, look, you know, just because there has been a taint of organized crime behavior in an industry, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be involved in a transaction. But if I'm looking at this big, there's this big chunk missing. Okay, those figures I quoted earlier, the 23 or whatever, the 23 and the 25 and 39%. I mean, that represents, again, $700 million. $100 million of that is gone into broker dealership commissions. So where's the rest of that gone? Has it gone into propagating or perpetuating, I should say, the Ponzi? A Ponzi scheme essentially is where you rob Peter to pay Paul. You take early investment capital, turn it around, and use that as a hook to bring in new investment capital, and you pay the earlier investors with new money coming in, so it perpetuates itself. And then you try and encourage them to park it and keep it in there. So what says that all of a sudden, if there's either mob money or mob-backed money in these dealerships, or more so probably on the cartage side, that this money was borrowed, there was money in there somewhere, and the loan's being called on it. You know, the VIG on, or what's called the VIG-ish, or the interest on mob money is always extortion. And if you're desperate, if you're in a GPB situation where, you know, you're trying to rob Peter to pay Paul, you need liquidity quickly, and the banks are looking at you askance because you just got raided by the FBI and FINRA, where are you going to go get money? You're going to go to questionable second and third party. You're either get junk debt, you're going to go out and get some other, legitimate source, or you're going to find something that may be quasi questionable. You're in New York, for crying out loud. There's all kinds of money floating around. So there are all kinds of things to me that stink in the way that money went away, especially when you look at the problems that they're having with the cartage side of this investment.
And that question of where that $700 million went is the thing that is the reason why there are raids and FBI interest and SEC interest and all of that. It's just too big of a question, and it's too much money.
Well, it's a classic Ponzi hole. I mean, when you see that kind of money just go away, it's either gone into the principal's pockets, or it's been laundered somewhere, it's sitting in the Cayman somewhere, or it's being used to recycle, the investment to keep it perpetuate, as I said, to perpetuate the Ponzi fraud.
Right.
So,
all right. Now I want to connect some dots here, and I'm going to say again from the beginning that this is suppositional. We are conjecturing right now when we're going into the territory I'm about to ask Jeff about. Okay, so this is not a matter of we are absolutely sure that this is what Scientology is up to or something, but we're going to give you some. We're going to give you some experiential and knowledge-based supposition, not just pulling it out of our whatever. Scientology has a thing about it that it attracts people to get-rich-quick scheme type setups. This has been going on in Scientology for decades. I mean, my parents got involved with Amway through Scientology. I have seen countless numbers of people. There's a guy out there, some of you might recognize his name or face if I showed it. Kevin Trudeau is a guy who's been bouncing around for decades with various get-rich-quick schemes and things he'll sell you that will allow you to remember things better, read faster, and he even got involved straight up in pushing Dianetics and was trying to sell Dianetics intro kits, which were the CDs in the Dianetics book. He was so bad. He was so blatantly out there that Scientology actually got rid of him. I remember that issue.
He's doing a hard time now, if I don't.
Yeah, he's in jail. Yeah. But he was around the PAC base, and he was getting, he was interested in Scientology, buying services, promoting Dianetics, and then it came up even on Scientology. The Sea Org guys were like, yeah, no, you're involved in stuff we don't want to be connected with, and they kicked him out. So I use that only as a single example. There are many, many, many of them that I witnessed over the years as a Scientology staff member and then Sea Org member. The most famous, of course, being like a Reed Slatkin type person who flat out running a straight up Ponzi scheme, got completely busted. A lot of Sea Org members, as well as Scientology public and non-Scientologists, lost a lot of money in that scam. That was a huge, huge scam. And of course, there were lots and lots and lots of Scientologists involved in that because Reed Slatkin was promising unbelievable returns on investment, and for years was feeding those investments. Was giving good returns to people, and then it all just fell apart because it was actually a Ponzi scheme. So that was a big, huge, flappy problem for Scientology. You have been looking at Scientology for a couple of years now, I think, as we've been talking about this stuff, and you have this unique background with this. So all that being said, what's your take on everything I'm sitting here talking about, and what do you see with this kind of stuff?
So I've always, anybody that knows my work around Scientology, I've always framed Scientology in terms of organized crime.
Yeah.
To me, that it's no different than Vito Genovese or the Colombos or any of these guys, right? And the reason I say that is that you have all the same behaviors that are, completely motivated by greed, all right, and business. The mob at the end of the day has always been a business. Murder and all these other things are just, they perpetuate the way that you make money. And this is why there was always a great debate about drugs and all these other things. But at the end of the day, it's always about money. And so is Scientology. In mob terms, it's, expanding the wealth of the family. In Scientology's terms, it's how do I get up the bridge, right? And I want money to get up the bridge. Scientology demands I give money to perpetuate the church. Money, money, money. Regging is just another form of extortion. Everything I pay on top of that's a bidge. I'm being charged 20% more because I'm having to throw it on a credit card, or they're going to take my house. All the crap that Scientology does to get money from people. No different. And where it all boils down to is the idea of affinity scams, or classic affinity scams. What an affinity scam is or fraud is where you're looking at, if you're the fraudster looking at marks that are based on common interest, or that are derived, or that are looking at aspirational things above and beyond greed. So, Tony Robbins is a classic example of this. He gets people to buy into this idea that he's going to make you a better person. But hey, if it doesn't work, oh well. But you're with a lot of other people that are trying to think the same thing. Meanwhile, you're going to get charged for books and tapes and all the other stuff. That's not necessarily a fraud, but it's premised on some things that are very questionable. So then, if we look at the Slackens of the world, or the GPBs, or these other guys. The Spina brothers, $80 million, right? Medicare fraud. The thing that you always see in Scientology, what I call Scientology capering, is that it's always repeatable. The fraud is always repeatable. It's almost a template. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of wise protocol or some policy letter that says, when you go to a wise seminar, don't forget to talk about the XYZ Medicare fraud, except it's not fraud. It's just how you can leverage your existence with the federal government to help build your wise business, right? So, to that, we look at the idea of, again, the mob feeds this idea of elitism. It feeds this idea of, we're in this together, we can make money, blah, blah, blah. But gangsters are always capering against each other. They're always ripping each other off. It's always about money. Scientologists, the same way. They're always screwing each other to get money to get up the bridge, or to reg, or to get status, right? I mean, the IAS is nothing more than trying to go from a street soldier to a capo di tutti capi to consigliere to running the mob, right? No different. It's all climbing the frickin' ladder. And it's pathetic, really, that the church sits there and tries to put some kind of legitimacy on this whole wise nonsense. Because at the end of the day, it's always about more money for the church, or for the mob, for the family. And so,
that's right. And just to be clear for anybody who's a little confused right now about this reference to wise, in case you don't know, WISE is an actual division of the Church of Scientology. It's called WISE, which is the World Institute of Scientology Enterprises, which is this cute acronym of WISE, which is Scientology business people. They are required to actually sign up with WISE and pay a membership due, and that gives them the right to use L. Ron Hubbard's administrative policies and procedures in their own business. And they are heavily encouraged to do this, to the point that Scientology has rewritten L. Ron Hubbard's policies and directives into secularized versions that can be used by any business. And they heavily encourage Scientology business people to adopt Hubbard's ways of running their own organization. So that's nominally what it's all about, but it's also a networking vehicle for Scientology business people to connect with other Scientology business people. And they have conventions and seminars, and they foster these relationships. And this is how people like David and Chili can get in touch with other wealthy Scientologists and propose investment schemes like GBP Capital. That's just one avenue that sort of thing happens on, but I'm just letting you guys know what that's all about.
I also find it interesting that if you look at the preponderance of WISE businesses, they're around chiropractic, insurance, dentistry. Not that dentistry is probably as fraudulent, as rife with fraud as chiropractic, but they're always around things that there's an insurance component to. And insurance is always been a classic vehicle for fraud. And it's just everything that you look at around the way that Scientology proposes a WISE business be run is always questionable in the way that even for the most ethical people on the planet, they're always looking for wiggle room about how they can scam somebody, either themselves or some other entity, because again, the greatest number of dynamics for the greatest number of good. Right? I mean, it's this whole idea of, we're going to save the planet, we need money to save the planet, blah, blah, blah. So right out the window, there's this whole, in fact, going back to your point earlier about the way that Scientology operates and the regulators and a lot of, or not the regulators, but some of these, I would say most people involved in a lot of these frauds, is this idea of willful blindness. And what willful blindness is a legal term is where somebody that should know better looks the other way, for lack of a better explanation. And Scientology and a lot of private equity is rife with willful blindness. In fact, if you look at most RICO cases start with willful blindness, right? Because somebody just didn't want to do the right thing. And before you know it, you've got all these predicate crimes. Bang, the feds come in and say, pal, you're going away because you have this pattern of illegality because somebody just decided not to do the right thing.
Exactly. And this, I'll just pipe in here from the Scientology perspective of where are their heads at that they would do this, or that they would act that way, or be so negligent or slack or not following regulations or whatever, is that really is an attitude that is inculcated from L. Ron Hubbard in his teachings. I mean, this is not a coincidence. It's not just chance that Scientology business people have this kind of attitude towards rules, guidelines, regulations that are meant to protect them and others that they're doing business with. That the Scientologist attitude that is fostered and sort of cared for and actually developed as you become a Scientologist is that you are the most important person in your universe, and that if you're doing something that forwards your survival and the survival of the Church of Scientology, which as you become a Scientologist, these two things become more and more aligned, that your interests and the church's interests become more and more the same, and you start equating them more and more as the same, you develop the attitude as a Scientologist that anything you do that improves or forwards Scientology and its mission is the most ethical thing to do, period.
Well, that and the rampant disdain for WOG law, right?
Well, that's where I'm going, because that's where that comes from. It comes from the fact that what we're doing is saving the world. What we're doing is providing, eternal spiritual freedom and immortality to all beings on planet Earth. There isn't anything more important than that in the end. So all of your compliance and regulations and guides and things that I have to do to make the world a better place, to me, become optional. I'll comply with them if I have the time, if I make the effort. It is only because I'm doing you a favor kind of thing. Because can't you see what I'm doing is so important and is literally saving the world. So I'm right, you're wrong in any calculation that I'm doing, right? And that's where the attitude comes from as to why, as well as the greed component, which is huge. Okay, but I'm talking about an underlying moral or ethical philosophy that justifies all of this behavior, right? Breaking any rule you have to doesn't really matter if the end, it's an end justifies the means mentality or philosophy is what I'm describing here. So I wanted to throw that in there into the mix so that you get the idea that when you're talking about Scientologists, you are talking about people who are in a different mindset than your average Joe. And that applies to Wall Street as well.
There's a great irony there in that, the mob never makes any pretensions about morality or the idea that there's, it's an amoral play to make money. Greed is good. It's Gecko's different, except it's a street. It's a Guido version of it, right?
That's right. And greed is good.
Or some of these other things. Any good investor will say, money is amoral. There is no, you can be ethical about something, but at the end of the day, you're just weighing the odds. It's risk. And so what makes something like GPB insidious is that was maybe taken into account, but yet there is just the underlying nature of pure greed and avarice all the way through the chain that compounds the problem. Those 68 broker-dealers, the actual Scientology mindset at the board level of GPB. So before you know it, you've got this toxic greed stew that is just saying, fuck it, we're not going to sit here and do anything by the rules. We want those returns. Now, mind you, at the beginning when they set this thing up, they did it right. They've got lawyer. This was a legitimate thing. But just like any other fraud that ends up, most Ponzi frauds end up becoming just it's like a juggernaut. The people that are in charge, they just have no way to control it because they never figured on the amount of either money going out or the actual caprice of behavior of those people that are part of the investments, or the fact that they just got caught up in making so much money, their common sense went out the window. Before they know it, they're having to cover their assets with whatever they can, right? Shades of Madoff. And this is why all of a sudden the feds come in and say, well, wait a minute. And, and how they can put press releases out that says, well, wait, we're just restating our books. Restating our books that says we got caught, as far as I'm concerned. Now, the whole thing is when you get into a court of law, how do you prove intent? So that's why I'm trying to be very circumspect here about the way, the Gentile's mindset and these other people who are involved. But, if I look at this thing forensically, it's like, yeah, right. So there we are.
Right, exactly. I'll speak to mindset only because I have the experience too, but I can't say for sure what's going on in David Gentile's head. I've never met the man. I can only speak in broad terms of the Scientology mindset and attitude, and the attitude that is inculcated into Scientologists. I'm not speaking at just from my own experience of what I believed as a Scientologist, but what I trained other Scientologists to believe, the attitudes I fostered and encouraged in others, and saw Scientology leadership foster in individual Scientologists. And greed is good is absolutely the mentality. Gordon Gekko would be a great Scientologist. And in fact, what we see in Gordon Gekko and what I find repulsive about Grant Cardone is all of the Gordon Gekko that I see in him.
The Gekko-ishness.
And I see you have a picture of him licking a bar of gold and big greedy smile on his face. And you just go, who is this person? What is that would make somebody be that way? It's because it is kind of a repugnant kind of attitude. It's all about, I got mine, and if you're lucky and work really hard, you'll get yours too. And you just pay me $1,000 and I'll tell you all about how to do it. And that's Grant Cardone in a nutshell, And I just kind of find that kind of personality a bit repugnant. There are lots of people out there who are just, like moths to a flame to that kind of personality because they want to live that kind of lifestyle too. And that's the kind of personality that is often attracted to groups like Scientology. And they find Scientology appealing because it makes promises like that. So
yeah, aspiration and hubris go hand in hand a lot of times.
Yeah, it's unfortunate but true.
And it's the thing that's what makes these things work. Yeah. Everybody wants something for nothing. Everybody wants to turn their eye to that gut instinct that says, well, wait a minute. I think, maybe to bring things full circle. So where are we with GPB? Here we are in August, and on the 31st of July, Fidelity Investments, which is also aligned with, I think, what is it, the National Financial Services, which is like a clearinghouse for broker-dealers of securities and stuff like this, told investors in GPB to get those assets off their platform because they can't value them, which is a huge, huge blow to the legitimacy of GPB's portfolio. Okay, that's essentially saying we don't want you trading this here on one of the largest broker-dealer platforms in the country, right?
Okay.
And then you've got a class action lawsuit that's been launched by a variety of attorneys. I mean, the feeding frenzy around this thing on Wall Street amongst the blue chip law firms has been amazing. I think I was going through a LexisNexis search, and there's probably 30 or 40 very high-end, people that wouldn't, mess around given what they bill out per hour are going after this thing big time.
Wow.
And it's important to note that you don't necessarily sue. You go into arbitration, you file a claim with FINRA, and if the arbitration fails, then you go to law. You go to court. So a lot of these people are probably in the throes of finishing up that process. That are going to go to court, and that will be probably the downfall of GPBs. They'll be sued into Chapter 7 or Chapter 11.
Okay, got it.
I would give these guys a year, even if they try and restructure. I don't think they're going to be around much longer.
Do you see, based on what you're looking at and your experience and past cases similar to this, do you see jail time for anybody?
So white collar fraud it's on the scale of a Madoff. It was, clear as day that the thing was set up from the beginning as a Ponzi scheme. So this goes back to intent, means, motive, and opportunity, right? Three things you got to prove to some extent to have to go to court or to, have somebody in the dock and convict them. If the people that will, if anybody hangs for this, it'll probably be somebody in the, that in the compliance world, somebody on the board that had prior knowledge of the tenuous nature of these investments. Now, since Gentile is he's a fiduciary, he can't really sit there and plead ignorance. He may get convicted. He may, all these guys may, get convicted, but, jail, hard to say, and because, white collar crime certainly has, a criminal element to it where people go to jail as well. But I think it's going to be either if they do if it's prosecuted as a classic fraud, it may not end up as being, people, going away for 10, 12 years. If you go to some country club farm in Pennsylvania, who knows? But, if there's criminality involved where, there's money, there's mob money in there, or that there was, backhanders, people exchange, there was obstruction of justice, things like that, then you've got a RICO component to it if the feds want to go down that route. It's anybody's guess at this point. I don't want to speculate. Because the feds have gone silent. There's not a lot on the radar screen right now since those raids. They're probably doing their discovery. They're probably, they're doing their forensic accounting. They're crawling under the hood. Meanwhile, this thing is in limbo. They can't trade. I mean, they've pretty much been suspended as far as being able to issue new prospectuses. So we're in a holding pattern. I think out of this feeding frenzy of arbitration is more discovery that FINRA or actually the SEC or the FBI can subpoena or get a hold of and say, well, here we now have a pattern of malfeasance that is indicative of a major fraud, Ponzi scheme, what have you, they can that then becomes indictable, and that's when we get people in court, and that's when we start looking at people maybe going to jail.
Okay.
That's probably a year away.
Okay, got it. Now, there's one last little component to this that I want to ask you about. And again, this is all just sort of conjectural. But there was this guy that I think Jeff Augustine and I talked briefly about in our last podcast, who was sort of a second in command, and you had mentioned him earlier here in this podcast, who seems to have disappeared.
Oh, yeah, Manuel.
Yes.
I'll get that guy's name. So anytime you want to bust a very complex fraud or get a RICO indictment or something, you need somebody on the inside, you need somebody wearing a wire or something, somebody that can go in there and say, I saw this, or I actually cooked the books, and you give them immunity and they roll and you go. And this is where Mr. Manuel comes in, is why did he just all of us? I mean, he's been scrubbed off of LinkedIn. He's been scrubbed off he's gone. He's like a man, in the ether. So the only time that happens is, he's sitting, in a 55-gallon drum off the Caymans because the mob doesn't want him talking. I don't think that's the case. I think, he's turned himself in, or not turned himself in, but, they got the goods on him, or he was a whistleblower and has gone into, a witness protection program, or he's a cop. Who knows? But it's awfully odd for somebody of that stature to just disappear. So
that's why I wanted to comment on it.
Huh?
That's why I wanted to comment on it, because it was odd.
I think that I think the feds have probably squirreled him away, because he's a savvy guy. He's an operator. He's financially astute. He's also has a pattern of being around this kind of behavior in Scientology. So it's not like he can plead ignorance that he didn't know that he was hanging with a bunch of whales, right? So there's a conspiracy component to this. There's an obstruction of justice component to this. If they were destroying, this is why the feds raid so quickly when they hear about this stuff. They don't want people wiping hard drives and taking stuff to Iron Mountain and shredding it. I mean, they want to get the goods, right?
Yeah, exactly.
This is a big thing when you're looking at proving the existence of a fraud is the paper trail. Obviously, follow the money. Always been the case.
Exactly. There's one last thing I wanted to ask about on this, and this is just sort of my own curiosity, and also potentially another, avenue of approach here with Church of Scientology itself. I know for a fact that Scientology invests some of its money. I know that from time when I was in the church, or at least in the past, they have. Because I talked to a person who worked at Int Finance who basically told me that. And this was an innocent conversation. I was just in the Sea Org at the time, so I wasn't, I didn't know everything I know now. But I found it interesting, and I've always pondered it. I remembered it because I always thought it was so odd to me that a church would invest parishioner money in the potential of really in a kind of gambling. I mean, that's what investments are. And, with parishioner money. And I've always sort of thought to myself, it's always sort of sat in the back of my head as something that seems off to me that the churches can do that. But I wanted to ask you about it. Now, we didn't talk about this beforehand, so I know I'm just kind of throwing this at you, but what's your view on that? Well,
so, churches are businesses, right? You have to reinvest capital. There's nothing that says they can't.
There isn't anything that says they can't. But then again, are they doing so with full transparency, and do people know that that's where some of their donations are going? That sort of thing.
The problem comes in with 503C status and the whole, the opaque nature of the way that the IRS monitors the funds in churches. My God, the Catholic Church, any huge church. The amount of money that's just floating around out there, right? So theoretically, they can file 990s, which are business expenses and, investment losses and things like that. So there is some transparency about the way they run their financial affairs relative to the business of the church, right? It's now how prudent their investment portfolio is a whole other question, right?
Well, that's what leads me, because I'm wondering, we cannot say, we're not in any position right now, I don't think you or I are, to say that Scientology did or did not invest in GBP, for example.
I'd be inclined to say they did. In fact, I'd be inclined to say I'd be inclined to say that they've invested in cargo. They're investing in anybody that is allied, because I think there's a quid pro quo where, okay, you give us a nice big chunk of cash in the IIS, we're going to turn around and give you some money to make your goal. Because inevitably, if those guys are making money, there's more money for the IIS at the end of the day, right?
Well, that's exactly true. Now, is there anything about that is legally questionable, or is that totally above the board's activity, and what's the problem?
Nothing's illegal about it, unfortunately. I mean, because
I think unfortunately, because
nothing says that they can't make a private donation to the church, right? I mean, this is what sucks about the whole First Amendment and religious protections around money in the church.
I'm telling you, if I was going to put regulations on that, at least I would put regulations on full transparency of where that money's going.
Just tax them.
It really, yes, exactly. I wasn't going to go that far right now, but yes, I am for taxing churches. But I really think that the transparency of church finances needs to become a public issue, because I don't agree that these guys should get all this money from various donors and then not have to report on what they're doing with that money.
Well, I think we've talked about this, maybe it's another podcast, but to me, the IIS is nothing more than a private equity vehicle inside of Scientology. I mean, I think it's used to not only fund the ideal lords, but to fund all kinds of stuff that, may have return on investment for whales, for Miscavige, for the church. I mean, there's what, $2 billion sitting in that thing? That's more than GPB, right?
Exactly. And you look at the nature of Scientology and Scientologists and what it's all about, and you go, there's no way that's a clean fund. There's no way there's not something snarky going on there. But how do you find out? There really is no way unless you're a government regulator.
Well, and even then, you'd have to subpoena it, and you'd have to have, and they would fight that to the 9th degree over church and state stuff and all that crap.
Exactly.
So this is the thing, is that until there is a private, and this is what they do so well in Britain and in Europe, is there, what's the private benefits test? All these things around where is this money going? This is the facade of the charade, I should say, whatever, of the whole ideal lord thing. I mean, it's a loss leader to make the whales, everybody feel happy that their money's being done something, but it's also a way to show the IRS, hey, we're doing something with all this money. Well, yeah, what else, right? So the thing perpetuates itself no differently than GPB does, and just a different guise, really, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I wanted to point that out to people because I think that is something that is an avenue that needs a lot more looking, but it's difficult because how do you look? How do you examine? How do you investigate?
You do have authors, you do have for-profit entities in Scientology. So it'll be interesting to see, how they run the money out of the church's nonprofit side into that for-profit side, so then they can write losses off. You can write off investment losses. So what's to say that they can't be running that money through? These guys are shrewd. They got good accountants working for them. So GPB, it's not like it's a laundering vehicle, but what says it's just not it's a way to hide losses or to manipulate cash flow back to other individuals in the church, i.e. high net worth individuals, the whales, that there is a quid pro quo relationship at this, what Jeff Augustine, I think, presciently calls the Scientology money club, right? It's all these dudes at a certain, it's Tony Ortega publishes a guide every year, right? The whales, there's your private equity. There's the people that are dealing with private equity in Scientology right there.
Yeah, exactly.
A bowling trophy. They don't get a 1099 at the end of the year. They get a bowling trophy. But hey, I'll take a bowling trophy if I'm getting 20% back on my money that's being run through the IIS to some investment vehicle in the Caymans. Let's do it, right?
Exactly. So there's a lot of potential there for some shenanigans, and I'm just throwing that out there for public interest, at large, because I want folks to realize that there could be a lot more going on under the hood than even we know about.
Understand the amount of money that went overseas in the Hubbard years before any of this stuff even existed. So there are Scientology vehicles in Luxembourg and other places that are untouchable because they are incorporated under European law. The IRS has no jurisdiction over them. That money, Scientology can repatriate it through Ireland or through wherever they want, completely legally or illegally, but the money trail is so opaque because it's been so long and it's pre the current regulatory environment. And they're not alone. The Church of Scientology, I mean, there's businesses, the mob, all kinds of people that run in the gray area money movement that know this. The feds know this. That's why FACTA came out, the Foreign Assets Tax Act in 2018, I think 2010, that said, you know, Americans cannot have numbered bank accounts anywhere in the world. You cannot have you have to declare all your world above and beyond what used to be the typical IRS thing. Now it's even, you know, high net worth individuals and all this other stuff. It basically pulled the rug out from anybody that was trying to skirt the law on keeping money abroad outside of the purview of the IRS. But even that doesn't apply to a lot of pre-existing money that was, again, incorporated, that was taken abroad and then incorporated under vehicles that are under Europe, that aren't even subject to U.S. jurisdiction. So, right. You know, there we are.
So until we can figure out ways to actually examine that or investigate that very, very thoroughly, I think we're always going to have a little bit of a black hole there of, you know.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that's
I mean, Scientology, again, you know, we bang on Scientology, but they're not alone. I mean, this is, hell, I mean, Apple and Google run all their money through Ireland for the same reason. You know, it's all, and this is the difference I want to make clear to people too. Money laundering is not the same as tax avoidance or tax mitigation. Tax mitigation is legal. Tax avoidance is not. Money laundering involves the process of illegal activity. All right. So just because, you know, the Church of Scientology has a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean they're money laundering, because that money's come in the form of donations. It's come in, it's got provenance, what's known as provenance. It can be proved where it came from. Now, what they do with it, and, you know, to mitigate their tax exposure, well, they don't really have too much because they're a church. Now, the for-profit side, again, often services, or maybe their international build, you know, the construction side of it, or, you know, where there's a lot of activity that's not really related to the church. There's areas that they might be able to play in that gray area with that capital there that might be construed as tax avoidance or money laundering. Who knows? Right.
Okay. Well, until the IRS and these regulatory bodies get really serious about this, and I mean, I could just imagine the years of scandals that would ensue if we wrote laws here in the United States that called for full transparency of church organizations.
Well, I would say, I mean, the laws are there. It's the institutional will. I think, you know, the whole 93 agreement with the church and all, I mean, that's an administrative letter could yank that thing. But yet, you know, now that the way the IRS has been restructured, we lost that window. Now, I guess, you know, it has to go literally up to beyond the commissioner level. Jeff's really work on that, Jeff Augustine.
No, he and I have talked about that, and it's crazy.
Well, there were structural remedies in place that could have fixed the problem with the church. Right. But they've done their thing. They are so good at safe pointing and or obfuscating officialdom. But here we are having the same goddamn conversation again and again, right?
Well, only in that it's another angle from which to, you know, look at how they might be getting away with stuff, so that bright people out there who might be eventually listening to this, whose job it is to, you know, figure this stuff out, might figure out ways to dig in and actually get this stuff, exposed. Because I think it needs to be.
Yeah, it does. But the collective will has to be a reappraisal of the First Amendment protections of churches. I
agree.
Way beyond Scientology.
That's right.
And the founders were very clear in the sense that, the separation of church and state was because of the nightmarish institutionalization of religion in Europe.
Yep.
And you come here, and the evangelical right has co-opted the whole idea of what constitutes faith and protection. What makes a megachurch any different than GM, right? That's money, right? And it has nothing to do with proselytization if they have to pay tax. So these are the things that people have to stop hiding behind, is that the idea that there's nothing. there's an irony there of, Jesus in the temple with the money launderer, or with the money launderers, with the money lenders, right? Might as well be money launderers. And yet, where's that lesson lost on, these politicians that sit there and say that, well, we should have all the money we need to spread the word. No, you shouldn't. You should be able to spread the word relative to paying your fair share like everybody else does, relative to the value you bring to society. But there's always needs to be a baseline of what that value is. If I pay an alternative minimum tax every year, why should the church? Because they are a business at the end of the day.
Exactly. And that's why I always go back down to this business of, well, one, it's a money-making scam, but in the bigger picture, okay, fine, it's a business, but it's not really business because it's nonprofit. Like, there's all these layers of deception starting like at the core level.
Well, and here's the thing: I've been around I've consulted nonprofits. Nonprofits make a lot of profit. So the thing you have to look at is what is fair and equitable. And this is where the devil in the details is, because it's so agenda driven. And this is the elegance of the public benefits test that they have. Again, I lived in England for 8 years. A lot of stuff they do really well over there when it comes to charity. The idea of what is the public good? What is a charity? What is a nonprofit? Understand, yes, we know that you have to have a viable operating budget. You have to have things that there's okay to pay. But, over here, the head of Goodwill Industries should not be making, $30 million a year if it's a nonprofit, right? That's absurd. You go into that idea to run and the argument about, well, we need the best and the brightest. You don't need to pay them $30 million to run a secondhand shop, right? All right, so let's look at this relative to what the net worth of the actual business is, what it's doing, and what the chops it takes to run that business. Okay, nonprofits, charities, all that should be recognized for what they are as a specific segment and regulated accordingly, as far as I'm concerned.
I could not agree more. And I think that if we as citizens want to look at, well, what can we do? Or what should we have our attention on? Or what should we be voting for in order to turn this around? It might not be so obvious that taxing churches or demanding more, compliance on that front. It might be the way to fight Scientology, but it actually is.
Well, sure.
All these cults. These groups get away with this, and America is very. Somebody asked me weeks ago about how come the cult problem in America is so much bigger than it is in Europe. Are Americans just stupider? And, are they more prone to cults? And my answer was, of course, no, because there's plenty of cults in Europe, too. But I didn't get into this aspect of it, which is that in America, the laws and the lack of compliance and oversight and all of that make it so much easier to form a cult in America than it is in other parts of the world.
What that plays to is the idea of the individual, the sense of individualism that is at the heart of what it is to be an American.
Yep.
And, again, having lived in Europe for 8 years and traveled there, there's very much a collectivist mindset over there, that the individual is not as sacrosanct as they are here. And so all the stuff the legal milieu, if you will, around this is all geared at the idea that I have an individual right to worship the way I want, freedom of individual, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, but it also doesn't mean that you can enslave people and feed them rice and beans. All this other stuff. And see, this is where we lost the plot on separating behavior from belief, which is another mantra of mine that we've lost. All right. We're talking about behavior, not belief. Behavior is a structure around which that we frame people's ability to exercise that belief relatively unfettered. But it still doesn't mean that, you could be, head of the zombie beavers cult and go out and, beat the shit out of people just because they're zombie beavers, right? It's nuts. And I cannot see why we just don't get that. It frustrates the hell out. But,
you and me both, man.
Public benefits test, all this stuff. It's simple stuff. It is not rocket science,
That's right. That's right. Exactly. And I think we're going to wrap it up at that, because there's a whole other tangent I could go down on that. We're going to leave it at that for now. I just want to give you guys out there some food for thought. We talk about this stuff. We conjecture about certain aspects of it. But at the end of the day, it is a greedy, it's pretty selfish. When we talk about Scientology and we talk about, the shenanigans these guys get up to, it is greed-based, selfish-based nonsense.
I call it's rapacious capitalism.
Yeah,
all right.
perfect.
You know, this is what, you know, private equity is rapacious capitalism. You know, most people say, well, capitalism itself is rapacious. No, it's not, to the extent that if you look at, you know, the way, you know, free markets and free minds should work, nah. But when you create vehicles just for the sense of creating wealth out of theoretically nothing, that's rapacious as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of what this is, even though there's product or services involved, you're bundling it in such a way that it exponentializes both the profitability and the risk. And why? Outside of just making money, there's no other reason to. So to me, that's rapacious. You know?
Fair enough.
I'm a classic free market, free mind guy, but I mean, at some point you got to pull the plug and say enough, because it's bringing the whole thing down, right?
Well, that's right. Exactly. And that kind of cycle of greed that we see perpetuated over and over again is, you know, the system sort of creates it, sort of perpetuates it, but really it's the thing that's going to destroy the system if we don't, you know, if we're not more careful about this.
We still have not recovered from 2008. We have still not probably recovered in some instances the tech bubble in 1999, for crying out loud. Market behavior is transcendent, you know, and people don't get that. Even a lot of economists miss that, you know, because they're focused on, you know, demand curves and all other stuff, but they're forgetting it's the behavior of people in the marketplace. You know, people get skittish. They have long memories. You know, I look at, you know, part of my mother's trust was wiped out because of 2008. Am I going to sit there and want to go back and look at another wealth management company, or am I going to want to go back and look at something else? You know, I'm going to sit there and say, well, screw that. I'm going to look at some other more, you know, traditional investment. Meanwhile, there might be something out there, but because of some idiot that is, you know, decided that he was going to screw somebody in Salinas or the Central Valley on a bad real estate deal, all of us pay for it. You know, this is the thing. Not just, you know, this is where, you know, it's a mistake that people think that Wall Street operates in a vacuum. So anyway.
All right, fair enough. All right, Jeff. Well, again, thank you very much for taking the time to contribute to this and be part of this conversation. Now, you did a lot of work on this. You spent hours researching it, and I really appreciate it.
No problem.
And your educated view on this stuff is valuable, and I hope everybody got something out of this.
Thank you. And again, I would tell go out to Jeff Augustine's Money Project too if you want some other context on this. There's some really good stuff out there. And there's a surprising amount of press releases that have been put out by the legal folks that are suing GPB that are very eye-opening. And I'm surprised at the amount of public information around this thing. Usually these things are kind of a dirty secret kept under the hood, but there you are.
Okay, man.
All right,
guys. Any questions, comments, feedback, leave it in the comment section here on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com. I am always interested in your feedback on this stuff and where we're going and what else you might also like to see or hear here on this podcast. So thanks for coming around, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.